So let's go ahead and get started. Before we do, I want to give the biggest of shout outs to the amazing technical team who has helped us work through lots of AV issues this morning. You guys are great. Thank you so much. My name is Stacy Conkio. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager for Altmetrics.com, and I am co-chairing this session along with Robin Champeau at, what is your full title, actually? All right, good old simple scholarly communication librarian at OHSU just down the road. And we wanted to organize a very practical session today. So we're welcoming you here to this session, Altmetrics in My Career, Real Barriers or Limitations of Our Minds. And so with our speakers today, we're going to really take a pragmatic approach to exploring what altmetrics can help us understand and how they can and cannot be applied to help us fully understand questions of and communicate the engagement with the reach and impact of one's work. So we're going to do this by diving into our first panelist research on scholarly communication and social media. Our second and third speakers are going to then take us through their use of altmetrics in their careers, use cases for which traditional metrics in many ways are not the best tools. So our first speaker, Stephanie Haustein, is a postdoctoral researcher in bibliometrics at the University of Montreal, focusing on social media and scholarly communication and making sense of altmetrics. In addition to her prolific research into altmetrics, Stephanie is also involved in making altmetrics more reliable in her work as a co-chair for the NISO Working Group on Altmetrics Data Quality. So today, Stephanie is going to explore the meaning of altmetrics. And next, librarian Heather Coates is going to share her insights into demonstrating the impact of her work as a practitioner scholar. Heather is a digital scholarship and data management librarian at Iupui University Library in Indianapolis. Go Panthers. And she is an active contributor to the vibrant data librarian / specialist community practicing in academic and research libraries. And finally, joining us virtually will be Holly Bick, a research scientist at the Center for Genomics and Systems Biology at New York University, soon to be on the team at UC Riverside, if I understand correctly. In addition to her research, which uses DNA sequencing and computational biology tools to explore the biodiversity of microbial species in diverse habitats, Holly is a dedicated believer in science communication and outreach, serving as an associate editor for the popular marine blog Deep Sea News. Holly is also a passionate open science advocate, and today, Holly will share her expertise in using altmetrics to track the impacts of open science activities. So without further ado, we'll start things off with Stephanie.
Thank you for the introduction, Stacy. So today, actually, before talking about practical stuff and how to use altmetrics, I actually want to step a little bit back and talk about theory and definitions. So actually we have a problem with altmetrics. We're lacking a clear definition. So a lot of people have been talking about it. You've heard about it in the last 5 years. It was kind of a hot topic with all the major publishers now actually providing altmetrics or at least using them in some form. This is just to give you an overview. This didn't come from nothing, but we actually had webometrics before that were already trying to capture broader impact, broader research impact, not just the citing authors and the publication output on the web. So basically, we have some works that go back to 1998 where Blaise Cronin was already talking about these kind of polymorphous mentioning that are likely to become a defining feature of web-based scholarly communication. Then later, you all probably know that it was Jason Bream that was coining that term in 2010. Since then, we've had a couple of approaches to defining what altmetrics are, but other than that it's a good keyword to find with high precision the papers on altmetrics, I actually think it's not a really good term. And the definitions that we have, so Jason's approach was to say altmetrics are the study and use of scholarly impact measures based on activity in online tools and environments. And just recently, and I think you can actually still comment on this definition of the NISO Working Group A on altmetrics use cases and definitions. And they are saying altmetrics is a broad term that encapsulates the digital collection, creation, and use of multiple forms of assessment that are derived from activity and engagement among diverse stakeholders and scholarly outputs in the research ecosystem. What you see here, if you look at the definitions, they're that broad that they always have to say all of that, but not citations, right? So they want to do something differently, something alternative to citations. But if you look at these definitions, they could actually include them. So I think these authors have really done a great job in trying to define it. But the reason why I think these definitions are not really good is because I think citations are not so different. So we should not have a definition that excludes citations. So if you look at this indicator space or the different kind of metrics that we've always been using in scholarly communication, we have bibliometrics, we have scientometrics, which includes patents, for example, so it's a little bit broader than just the publication output. And Altmetrics is a subset of webometrics. But the problem of Altmetrics is that it's quite heterogeneous. So it includes something like tweeting about a paper, tweeting about a scientist. But also recently, for example, the company Altmetric has started to collect citations in policy documents, right? And if you compare that to a regular citation, it's actually, I think a citation in a paper can be very heterogeneous too. So if you look at a brief mention in the introduction of a paper that just said, Preem 2010 did this, right? That is actually more comparable to a tweet that just, oh, there's a paper that did this, than a really intense or more frequent citation in the method section where you basically use the method of a paper and base your whole research on that, right? So the same thing applies kind of for Altmetrics. These things are very heterogeneous. So what me and my colleagues have tried to do is step away from trying to define Altmetrics as something different than citations, but to talk about scholarly metrics in a general sense. And that would be defined as recorded events of acts related to either scholarly documents or scholarly agents. And documents here is a very broad definition, actually going back to Paul Otlet in the 1930s, that it could be anything that is documented. So it can be a research paper, it can be a book, a blog post, a data set, it can be code, it can even be a tweet itself, right? That is also a document. And the scholarly agents that we're talking about, that could be the individual researcher, but it could also be the university as a whole, a funding institution, or a journal. So these kind of acts that we are talking about here could be viewing, reading, saving, diffusing, mentioning, citing, reusing something, modifying it. All of these things actually happen and I think should be incorporated into something that we want to measure as kind of impact of research. So me and my colleagues came up with this framework to have these different types of acts incorporated and showing that citations are in the middle of that. So either you have the document that I just talked about or the agent on the other side, and you can do a lot of different things referring to either the document or the agent, right? You can, and we have these three different levels of access, of engagement, from something more broader access, like you're just viewing the metadata of a paper, you're actually clicking on it, accessing the content, and then you might be storing it somewhere with the intention to read it later, but you don't have to. But then if you start to engage more, you're actually reading it, you're mentioning it, and you could briefly just mention there is a paper that is interesting, or you could actually take out some of the content and discuss it. You might be reusing the method and so on. So the last step would be applying the content of either this document or the agent, so that collaboration would be that I'm working with someone and trying to reuse their knowledge. But all these are different levels of engagement, and Altmetrics appear in all of those different levels, and citations do as well. So I think we should kind of step back and stop this black and white between Altmetrics and citations. They're not that different, actually. So if you look at just four examples of Altmetrics, saving to Mendeley, being mentioned in a newspaper article, being recommended on F1000 Prime, or tweeting, they're so heterogeneous, and between all of these sources we have different audiences too. So if someone is using Mendeley, they must have some kind of motivation to organize scientific literature, right? So this will not be the general public on Mendeley because they have no interest in saving references. So we do actually see that most of the users on Mendeley are academics, a lot of them early career researchers, students, PhD students, and so on. So if we're using this as a count, as a metric that has an impact on what we're actually referring to, With news, it's completely different. It's very selective. You have one journalist that writes about you. It's written for the general audience, and we've heard about that in the discussion this morning. Recommending an F1000 prime is also very selective, as in that after publication, experts are selecting papers that have very high merit and that are very interesting to read. But again, this is for the scholarly community. And tweeting can be anything, right? So Twitter has always been heralded as the platform where we can measure societal impact of research. But actually we're finding more and more that it's not per se the general public that are tweeting scientific papers, but it's more the academic audience themselves. So it doesn't mean that just because you're tweeted that this is societal impact. And just because you're on social media, this is not societal impact. But we do have the opportunity to measure different types, and I think it's now a challenge to actually find out how we can differentiate between these different audiences. And even if you look at these examples within one type of platforms, so here on Twitter, you see different types of tweets. So on the left side here in blue, actually these are tweets, and you see with a percentage that one-to-one take the paper title and just diffuse it. So we see JSIS, for example, there is a journal that has been just tweeting the paper that they published. The one on the very top, we found out that there are actually a lot of bots that automatically take, in this case, the RSS feed of arXiv and just tweet everything. So there's not even a human involved, really, right? So this is automatic and diffusion and not a lot of discussion. But if you look at the right-hand side, there are people actually that are saying something about the content and recommending the paper and so on. So even within one platform, we have different types of use. And if you look at this study that I think probably most of you have heard about by Richard van Noorden at Nature, that surveyed researchers how they use different platforms for research, and you see that Twitter has a lot of more higher engagement, so people follow discussions, comment on research, actively discuss research, while Facebook is hardly used for research work. And Mendeley, again, of course, you discover papers there. So these platforms are very heterogeneous. What we also see, actually, that the tools themselves have an effect of how you behave, right? So the affordances that you get on Twitter, that they shape what and how you tweet. But we've also seen weekday effects. So, for example, papers are, they get the most of their activity just after they have been published. But if they're published on a Saturday or Sunday, it's being pushed more towards a Monday. So it's a really workday pattern. And yeah, so it kind of influences also how and where you use Twitter. Maybe if you're on your mobile phone on the commute, you're more likely to retweet something than if you're reading a paper very intensely. You might not be on Twitter, so you're not tweeting it. So to be tweeted doesn't automatically mean engagement, and not to be tweeted doesn't mean the absence of engagement. And I think these are things that are quite different from what we know from citations, and we have to keep that in mind. So what we also see is that different platforms are used differently. So in that study by Nature, they showed that ResearchGate was actually the platform that was most frequently used. But if you look at how people use it, it was just in case of contacted. So we all know that ResearchGate is sending a lot of emails, of notifications. So that's when you go and click on it. But just that it's spread and used by a lot of researchers doesn't mean that there's a lot of engagement behind that. But of course, we have to keep in mind who are the people that are creating the metrics, the counts for the metrics that we use, right? So if it's only grad students that are on Mendeley, or only the assistant profs that are on Twitter, that has an effect of the metric that we're using. And we actually see some of these, the types of use and the audiences behind the metric. So this is actually just showing you the coverage, so the percentage of recent, and this is 2012 papers, that have at least one mention or one save on those different platforms. And you see that Mendeley is just short of 70%, and actually for those recent papers, similar to citations, so to get at least one citation. So there's a lot of activity happening. A lot of papers are being shared on Mendeley. Actually, for more recent papers, it's going up to 80%. For Twitter, it's about 1/5. So 80% of documents never get any tweet. It is going up, but still, this is completely different. And then if you look at Facebook public shares in this case, blog posts, newspapers, it's is very selective and tiny. So for the majority of documents, this is never happening. If you look at the mean event count per paper, so the number of, for example, Mendeley readers per document, you see that for the most recent documents, there are actually more people saving a document on Mendeley than that have cited it. So there is a lot of activity going on. Whereas it's very low for the other social media accounts, so there's not that much going on. And last but not least, what we're always doing is correlating with something that we know, that is citations. And except for Mendeley, we see very low to non-existent positive correlations. So Mendeley, again, shows, though, an academic use. It's not highly correlated, but there are moderate positive correlations with citations, so not everything that is added to Mendeley gets cited. But we've also seen from some surveys, and we're exploring this more, that there is an interest. If you add something to Mendeley, you're probably going to cite it later, or at least have an interest to do so. We also know that there are differences by discipline. So if you look at the percentage of papers having at least one tweet, it's much higher in biomedical and health sciences, in social science and humanities, than in math and computer science, or in physics, for example. Why? Well, on the one hand, people can relate to a social science paper, but they don't understand high energy physics, right? So there is certainly something where the society has larger interest in that, but we also have to be aware of and how far this is actually the communities themselves. So we know that physicists and mathematicians, they're not very active on Twitter. Well, if you compare that to someone in biomedicine, this is different. We also see different patterns regarding document types. So for example, actually what we call the so-called non-citable items, so editorial material, book reviews, corrections, letters, and particularly news items, so that usually don't get that many citations, are actually the document types that get a lot of attention on Twitter. So you see that it's mostly editorial material and news items, condensed formats that are probably already written for a larger audience. So we have to keep that in mind, that we're finding different patterns, and that, of course, influences the metrics that we use. So to sum up, we have very heterogeneous platforms, acts, users, and also user motivations that are using different platforms that we are basically harvesting metrics from, and that are already being applied right now on journal pages in different contexts. Impact Story, for example, provides that for the author. And we don't know yet fully, or we haven't really fully understood the role of social academia and scholarly communication. So it is being used, but we don't always know why, how, and who. And still the question from like the first year of Altmetrics, I think, is still there. Are we measuring societal impact, scholarly impact, or just buzz? I think it's a mix of all of these, and it's really up to us to figure out how to filter it better. And we have a lot of limitations in data collection still. So right now, although Altmetrics want to be broader and capture the impact of different types of outputs, de facto it's limited to DOIs, which mostly means peer-reviewed articles. So that's also a big problem. And then last but not least, I would really advise to pay attention to adverse effects. So we know that from bibliometrics, since we're using the number of publications as an indicator for productivity and the citations for impact, people have started to change their behavior, right? You start salami slicing, you publish more, you self-cite more, and so on. If we apply this to Altmetrics, this can be very problematic, so we don't want the tenure decisions to be made on the number of followers on Twitter and so on. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions later.
So next up is librarian practitioner Heather Coates.
So thank you, Stephanie, for that excellent segue, because I'm going to be talking about how I'm using these things in my dossier and hopefully not raising red flags as I do that. So my thanks to Stacey and Robin for including me to be here today. The opportunity to talk about this is really giving me a nice excuse to reflect as I go through the process of writing my dossier. And so I want to just share a little bit about what I mean by practitioner researcher or practitioner scholar. So I'm sharing my pragmatic knowledge of Altmetrics in terms of how I've used them for myself and with our faculty on campus. I've not done a lot of research with them. But I feel like, there's different types of knowledge, and we need some more pragmatic, practical experience to help us understand how different types of scholars and different types of activities can really be reflected in how we're presenting and talking about altmetrics. So I'm going to briefly talk about the institutional context for my promotion and tenure case, and then my case itself, so that you understand some of the decisions that I've made. So I'm going to walk you through the 3 sets of products and the associated metrics that I'll be sharing, but I also want to talk about some broader implications and why I care about this and why I'm really interested to further this discussion. So, oh, that did not look right. Okay. So, promotion and tenure guidelines for Iupui. We have our 3 areas are performance, professional development, and service. Oddly, the requirements for tenure and promotion are slightly different, but for librarians, performance has to be excellent. Our secondary criteria, which in my case is professional development, otherwise known as research, has to be beyond satisfactory, and service has to be satisfactory. Now, I'm not going to unpack what that means. That's a whole other discussion, but I want to allude to some of that at the end. I do want to also point out that I'm really lucky to be at a campus and in a library that are OA friendly, that are open access friendly. So in 2015, my associate dean for digital scholarship was able to get these 2 statements added to our promotion and tenure guidelines. So Erin McKiernan has talked about this at OpenCon and at the Spark Forum earlier this year. But really, this sits within our institutional values section, and it's great. We don't know yet what that's going to look like in practice, so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. And so, as you'll see at the bottom, the second piece is how open access actually supports these other institutional values. And I think that's a key point to make, is that open access is not an end, it's a means to an end. Okay, so the elements for the Iupui dossier. So the candidate sections are just one piece of that, but that tends to be what we focus our conversation on. How do we as candidates make our case? How do we present our citation metrics and our other metrics? But what I think we're missing in this conversation is that this whole thing is a peer review process. And we're not leaving those impact judgments and those quality judgments to the peer reviewers. We're being encouraged as candidates to make those judgments ourselves within our narratives. And this happens, I think, not just at Iupui, but at all campuses, in that we're being asked to do the job, I think, of what is actually the external reviewers, our campus level committees. Okay, so that's sort of an underlying principle about how I'm presenting my metrics. I will present my products, and I will share the data, and I will describe how I think that demonstrates engagement, but I'm not talking about impact in my narrative. So let's unpack a bit of the candidate sections. So the guidelines and advice that I've received are to focus my statements on particular discrete products, right? I think that's probably fairly common. The narrative statements themselves are relatively brief. There's a 5-page candidate statement, a 2-page performance statement, and a 2-page secondary, for me, professional development statement. And that's really where I have to make my case. And so the evidence that's presented in those sections should support all of the statements that I'm making in that narrative. And the appendices are they're there. They really only get seen by the school level or the department level, in my case, the library committee. So I'm not entirely sure why we are asked to put together an appendix section. But I think it's a little bit more of the raw data, whereas the evidence in the main body of the dossier is sort of summary level data. Okay, so almost done with the context, and then I'm going to share some examples. So again, what I think is really important to know is to understand what I'm trying to accomplish as a librarian. So as the digital scholarship and data management librarian, and I'm also a liaison to the School of Public Health, I have 3 roles. And so I try to articulate the groups of people, the target audiences that I'm trying to influence. So for me, my primary audience are the Iupui faculty, staff, and students. And that's a particular focus towards those engaged in research on my campus. The next sort of level is data librarians. The next level are academic librarians, and then sort of researchers outside of those spheres. And these are the sort of broad, high-level goals that I have for my work. So for performance, one of the things that I've tried to do is to improve the research practices of the people on my campus, and to identify effective strategies for teaching research data management. For professional development, I try to identify best practices because it's still a very early area of meta research. We don't really know what works and in which situations and for whom. And I also try to identify incentives and barriers to data sharing and reuse. So these are very high-level things, but they inform what I've done in the products that I've created. And then finally, for service, these are all fairly typical. I feel like we try to contribute back to the communities that we've received from. So data librarians and specialists, and then the open science and research community. Okay, so the examples I'm going to share today are from my professional development products. And I'm going to talk about 3 sort of groups of products. So there's evidence-based practice. There's building data services and teaching research data management. So this first example here, and I apologize for the text glut, but you have these to look at later. So I wanted this to be, rich. So in the middle, the sort of white table is a summary of the products, the citations, which are low, because I'm, 4.5 years in, right? And then the views and downloads. So why I group these together is that I write these evidence summaries, which are post-publication peer review. They're critical appraisals of library and information science literature. And they're published in a journal called Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice, which I really believe in and I think is an excellent model for post-pub peer review in librarianship. So the data sources, which I'm not sure that you can see all that well, are publisher statistics. So it's an OA journal, and they run in OJS. And then our institutional repository server. So I've aggregated those because, the reviewers will not care which source they came from, I don't think. And then, so I will be, in my narrative, I will be talking about how these products relate back to my goals. What I am not able to do, but this is sort of that long-term picture, is I'm shooting for these outcomes. I want librarians to use these evidence summaries to make choices about how they practice. And I want librarians to improve how we conduct and report research. So I hope that these publications are a model for that. Can I demonstrate that with these metrics? No. And I'm not going to pretend to. So I see the outcomes of my career as something that is much more appropriately measured by program evaluation methods than Altmetrics. But what I feel like Altmetrics can do is to demonstrate or to indicate that I'm engaging with certain communities or that there is interest. Okay, so, and then the last piece I want to highlight, and you'll see this come up on the next 2 examples. So I use the Becker Model from Washington University. They have a really rich model for assessing research impact. And they have 5 sort of main areas of domain, but what they've got is a really nice reference document that maps out for each of the 5 areas the different kinds of products and how they demonstrate impact within those domains. So if you have not seen it, I would highly recommend that you look at it because it's really, I think, eye-opening for us to think about how all the work that we do isn't necessarily reflected in these metrics. So for me, I tend to focus in my narrative on the advancing knowledge piece. Translating research into practice is actually the biggest sort of theme within my dossier. It's most important to me as a practitioner that I can take knowledge or that I can create knowledge that then other librarians can use. So, and then we've got community benefit. Hopefully I'm giving back to the data librarian and specialist community. So the next two examples are fairly similar. So this is actually a group of teaching materials that I've developed for our research data management lab and workshop series. And those were shared on SlideShare, so that's where all these metrics come from. And so you can see the goals and the meaning, again, sort of my ultimate purpose with this is the same. And then the final example is the group of work that, or the sort of group of products that I've created around building research data services, because there are not that many data librarian positions within academia. There was lots of angst when I started my job about how do I do this? What am I doing? Like sort of this vision defining the scope and boundaries of what this role is. So this is sort of a weird mix of products. So there's some presentations, some publications, but again, so the sort of scope of the metrics here are a little bit more diffuse. And what I can say from this is that people are seeing my work. I've had some sort of, I've had people who have made connections based on that, and that anecdotal evidence, I think, is what is more powerful in terms of demonstrating that impact and that engagement. But I'm certainly going to use this, or am using this to say, my work is being disseminated, and I'm trying to make it openly accessible in as many ways as possible. And some of those people are then reaching out to me and we're collaborating, or they're using my work. Now, I would love to be able to trace down the people who downloaded some of these things to see if they actually use them. That would be the holy grail for me. But we're not there yet, so. Okay, so I want to take a moment to pause because I talk really fast. Okay. So I want to take a moment to let's reflect on what do we not talk about when we talk about promotion and tenure. So I want to give you a second to think about this. Okay. So I would really like to think that we all make rational choices, that we sort of weigh all the criteria about how we make choices about where to publish and what research to do, and in a very sort of proactive, rational way. But I don't think that we do. And if we do, we don't, as a group of researchers, or I guess the field doesn't understand how academics do their research and make choices. So I think it's a little bit of a black box, and a little bit, some of our decisions, we look a little bit more like mad scientists than rational people. So I want to talk about some touchy-feely stuff that I think is really important, so bear with me. If you want to get up, or if you want to tune me out at this point, that's totally fine. I'm going to channel Brene Brown right now. Shame is a big problem. So I think that a lot of the sort of angst around promotion and tenure is because a lot of the valuable work that we do in our institutions is not reflected in the promotion and tenure process, period. It's not reflected in citation metrics, it's not reflected in Altmetrics. And until we address that, and until we try to develop a more comprehensive way of measuring all the work that we do, as teachers, as scholars, as members of a community, promotion and tenure is still going to suck. So I don't think that there's a metric solution to this, but I think when we talk about how people misuse metrics, we need to remember that. Also, shame leads to fear. The expectations are not always clear, although I feel like I have a fairly clear grasp on what's expected of me between our campus guidelines and then our library guidelines. But not all institutions do that. So we need to be more explicit about what the expectations are and how to do that. There's also those people who stand in the way. So there's red tape. There are people who just don't understand and they don't want to confront their ignorance and then resolve it, right? So we've got to make a compelling case in a story for why we need to solve this problem. Okay. So on a more positive note, I think we can mitigate a lot of the fear and the shame that happens throughout this process by creating and helping new early career researchers and students develop strong support networks. So an example of a group that's doing this is the National Center for Faculty Diversity and Development. They have tackled mentorship as this like dysfunctional thing in academia, and they are breaking it down into something that's actually useful. They have great workshops. There are lots of institutional memberships. So the last thing I want to say is that I think there are lots of problems. Metrics are a symptom. Misuse of metrics are just a symptom. But we can facilitate change if we envision a better future, if we envision what we want to see as opposed to diagnosing and sort of taking apart all of the problems that we see existing right now. And I think let's move on to Holly. I'm done.
Holly, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So Holly is up next. Just give us a second to sort of, she's going to share her screen and we're going to situate it here.
All right. Is that working, Robin?
Yeah, hold on one moment. We have to play with this a little. Oops. Give us 1 second, Holly.
Okay.
There we go. All right. Just a little smaller. A little smaller still? Okay. There? 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 Okay. All right.
All right. Maybe mute the microphone on your side. Just I can hear a little bit of feedback.
Okay. How's that?
That's turning off her audio.
All right.
How's that, Holly? Can you try that?
I can still hear you. You know what? That should be fine. I can't hear myself too much. All right. So I'm ready to go. Okay, all right. So let me just start by saying thank you to Stacy and Robin for setting me up remotely. I couldn't make it out there in person, but I'm really glad to have the opportunity to get this across to the audience at 416. So I'm going to narrow in on a very specific case study, and I think that the previous two presentations were a great segue. It sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about. So I am earlier career stage. I'm a project scientist right now, starting as an assistant professor at UC Riverside as of July. So as I'm embarking on the tenure track, right away I'm already starting to think about my alternate products. So things which are traditionally not scientific products such as manuscripts, but other activities that I'm involved in. So today I wanted to talk specifically about software development as a non-traditional research activity. So I'm a marine biologist, but I work with high throughput genomic data. And because the data sets that we generate are so large and so complex and fairly new in terms of how long they've been around in science, we're really dealing with the fact that we have to do software development and we have to develop new pipelines as we're trying to analyze these genomic data sets in order to get any useful biology out of them. So I've been sort of pulled into the world of software development, kind of in a meandering path. But I think a lot about how this activity of doing software development is really viewed by my peers. So in terms of tracking my accomplishments, thinking about tenure portfolios, software development still is not really rewarded or valued as much as hypothesis-driven research. And this is particularly true in biology, where we're used to designing studies and looking at organisms. Genomics has kind of changed the game a little bit, because now we're actually doing a lot more things on computers and a little bit separated from the organisms themselves. So there's a lag time in citations for new software products. A lot of times the type of software we're generating is scripts that we write on the fly to analyze a specific data set. We might put that on GitHub, we might publish it in supplemental material for the paper, or we might go full on and sort of package that into something more formalized in terms of an algorithm that we might also write a software paper for. But the problem that I'm facing, and I think many other people are too, is that there's a lot of software out there. We're all doing a lot of the software development, but it's not a very traditional research activity. So we're struggling with how to track dissemination of these types of products and usage of these products. And so they kind of have to be measured in other ways. And I think for me, as I'm trying to gather statistics for various end goals, I think a lot about what types of altmetrics are useful and are going to give me information that I can use moving forward. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about a software package that I was leading development of through the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So I was am principal investigator on a grant to develop a research-driven data visualization framework for high-throughput environmental sequence data. So this is a novel software framework to try and bring in more visual analytics into the analysis of genomic data sets. And really, this grant was to develop a prototype software framework, which hopefully will be adopted by the community and used by other researchers. The specifics. So I won't talk about the specifics of the framework too much, other than the fact that what we're really trying to do is build a kayak.com for massive genomic data sets. So traditionally, when we're dealing with sequencing data, genomics data, we deal with a lot of large text files on the command line, and that's just really time consuming, not the most appropriate way to get biology out of these data sets. So if you had something like kayak.com, where you could upload a data set and have slider bars on the left-hand side, you could have things that you could tweak, boxes you could check, uncheck, and then have a central space where the data was updated in real time, and you had some sort of visual information that you could use with your brain to process. That's what we were trying to do with the software framework. So what actually came out of that is a software called Finch. So it's online at finch.org, and this is what the visualization framework actually looks like. It's a browser-based tool. It uses JavaScript and D3 to visualize these genomic data sets, and this is just an overview screenshot of the different type of visualizations that are available. And the preprint is currently on bioRxiv right now. So there's different uses for this tool. One use is for research, so researchers who want to very quickly look at their data and get it into a visual context and make decisions about further sequencing or about papers that might come out. But another use of this framework is for education and outreach. So I've been working with citizen science projects to visualize genomic data sets that are actually sent in by the public. So this is the case where people were swabbing dust in their homes and submitting it to North Carolina State University. So these are microbial data sets being generated. And one of the problems is that citizen science don't have a research background. So, the challenge is really to find novel ways in which they can interact with these large data sets that they're helping to generate. So there's different audiences for this tool, and what we've struggled with in terms of Altmetrics is really capturing the usage of our tool, our framework, across these different types of audiences. So I'm just going to present a little bit of data from here. I'm not sure if I have answers, but I can just give you some insights on what we're actually trying to do and what sort of metrics we're trying to track in terms of grant reporting and renewal funding and those type of reporting requirements. So as I said, one of the main questions I'm interested in is we put this software out there, we developed it, it's on GitHub, it's on a website. So we really want to know who is using this Finch framework. And this is prototype software published in October 2014, so only about a year and a half ago. It's still fairly new. We're still spreading the word about it. actively trying to get back in developing and adding features after the prototype was stabilized and published out there. So this is, metrics that I'm tracking over a year and a half since the inception of the software, a very short time frame. So one of the first things we did is, because it's a web-based framework and because it's a website that people are going to, we can track website analytics, which is not something you typically think of as a research scientist that you should be keeping track of, but something we found pretty useful in terms of just figuring out how many people are accessing the site on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis. So in terms of website analytics, we can track geographic distributions. Most of our users right now are coming from the US, but we do have some uptake in the US, Canada, and then lower amounts of uptake from other countries around the world. In terms of actual users that are coming to the site, so we can look at peaks and in usage in terms of how many people are accessing the site across days and months, like I said. And really what we're interested, I think, in are some of these more cumulative statistics in terms of the number of page views. So this was a 2-month period in 2014 that I was tracking. And so we recorded over 3,000 page views, 50-50 split in new visitors versus returning visitors, which is good because that means that new people are coming to the site fairly regularly, and session durations. So this tells us a little bit that people are actually using the tool. They're not just clicking a link in Twitter and then closing the browser window, but average session duration is above 7 minutes. So hopefully that means they're actually staying there and uploading some data or playing around with our test data to try and explore the software a little bit more, which is all pretty good news for me in terms of disseminating the software and getting people to use it. Other things which I've noticed, and I'm on the fence about whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, is the impact of in-person regarding the software framework. So this is just a screenshot of website analytics over a couple months in 2014, and this coincided with some conference talks that I was giving. So I went to the Society for Molecular Biology and Evolution conference, and then I gave tutorials about the software at a undergraduate workshop and a microbial ecology workshop. And so this kind of reinforces the idea that even though this is an online tool and it's digital for all intents and purposes, the act of me personally, physically going to conferences actually resulted in a lot more page views and a lot more users actually accessing the site. So that sort of makes me think that this is really important. An important complement of doing software development is actually getting out there and almost being like a salesman at these type of events and going out and selling it for different types of purposes. The other thing, which is great, is that we use GitHub. So this is where the open science aspect comes in. So the code base is actually on GitHub. It's free to reuse or adopt. And GitHub is a code repository that provides its own set of statistics. So these are website analytics essentially for the code itself. So I've been tracking these as well. The address for the software is on the bottom if you're interested. But really, in terms of the code base itself, we can look at end users, so people that are favoriting the repository essentially. So that's kind of bookmarking the repository in case they want to use it or look at the documentation. We also have what's called forks. So forks is if you want to duplicate the code base and start making changes yourself. That shows up here as well. So this is not only the end user, so the biologist with no computational experience, but it's also the software developers who are out there in the community that might be looking at our code and modifying it and using it, which is great because we're trying to build up a community around this open source framework, and we're not, we don't have licensing, we're not charging people to use the software. So getting more people involved in the development is always a good thing as far as we're concerned. Here are some more stats from GitHub. So like I said, GitHub can sort of give us website analytics from a different perspective for the code base itself. So here we can have another view of referrals. So how are they getting to our site? We see that they're coming from GitHub itself, but also Google searches, our browser, public implementation of the code. They come from there, as well as Authoria, and some other institutes like the USDA. We can also see that people are looking at the wiki, so they're looking through the documentation, they're trying to use the software, and we can see the most popular pages are sort of the start guide, the homepage for the software, as well as the quick start, which is just the easiest way to get started, kind of a cheat sheet to what you need, which is, you know, it's nice to see these numbers. I'm not quite sure how they're useful, but in terms of collecting them, it's great that it's possible to actually get these statistics automatically by just putting the code online in an open source repository. So we can also look at issues. So issues are kind of like a help forum for users or developers. If there's something they have a question about, they can post them in this group forum. So we can see how many issues have been opened, you know, over a period of time, cumulatively. We can see how many issues we've engaged with, how many we've closed or answered, and just generally track the activity in terms of questions and answers between the developers so my end, the people who are developing the software, and the people that we're hoping are using the software. There's other things too. So in terms of the actual where our project is housed, we're tracking that, but we're also trying to use different social media metrics to see how much this software is being disseminated. So this is the case where I'm trying to track documents that are related to this software project and seeing how many people are actually reading them or sharing them. And so I actually posted the grant proposal itself on Figshare. Before the software was even online or had been developed, I had sort of put this on Figshare to announce to the community that it was in development. And so I have been tracking this on Impact Story, so getting Figshare views, downloads, views on Twitter, and Impact Story itself. And you know, we have badges for these. It's showing up as highly viewed, highly discussed, and coming into the 99th percentile on Impact Story for similar types of products, which is good, hopefully. Another thing that I've been tracking as well is the manuscript preprint on bioRxiv. So this was posted in 2014 while we're trying to get the software paper peer-reviewed and edited. So this is, again, some stats from Impact Story and Altmetrics, just showing how we compare to other papers that are out there. So we have an Altmetrics score of 15 right now. Our preprint is in the top 25%. You know, we're mentioned by 24 people on Twitter, and we have a timeline of when that activity happened. So really, it was as soon as our preprint went on bioRxiv, we had a flurry of tweets, which has since died down, which seems similar to some of the statistics that were quoted earlier. And the demographic breakdown is sort of 83% scientists versus members of the public. So these types of numbers are things we're gathering, as I said, reporting in grants. I'm keeping track of them. I like to look at how my in-person interactions, as I said, the conference talks or workshop demonstrations, how those actually translate to these type of metrics. Why Altmetrics? So why am I doing this? It's very time consuming, but I think hopefully it should be important in the long run in terms of planning my own strategy. So figuring out what works, what doesn't. And like I said, I think in-person talks that I'm giving are fairly effective in driving traffic to the website. But really what my main goal is to understand how effectively that I, as principal investigator of this grant, is really disseminating my research products. And as I go forward, as I start and have a lab group, I really want to be able to track my group's research products because I am probably going to have a lot of these non-traditional outputs such as software. So, you know, tracking things like who is using our tools, how are they discovering the software, and are we really meeting the end user needs? So if we want a community to build around this tool, we have to engage with the community, and we have to make sure that we're not developing this in isolation and being completely fooling ourselves about what people want and need in this type of software for genomics. For an open source software, you know, we're really keen to build a community around this. We're not getting royalties. We're not generating revenue streams through software licenses. So in an ideal world, we would really be able to encourage and foster the growth of a user community, but also a community of other software developers who can help us sustain and grow this type of data visualization framework in the long run. But really what I'm struggling with now, and I think that this is common for all of us, is figuring out what these numbers really mean. So it's great that we can track them. And I think for me, I think it is important that I do track them because I can have graphs and different statistics that I can show to people if they ask. But in terms of, in the long term, generating citations, generating people who are going to be using this tool and putting it in their research paper, I'm not convinced that these numbers are going to tell me anything or going to be able to predict anything. So with that, I'll just say thank you to my collaborators and again to Stacy and Robin for inviting me. Thank you.
All right, so you are off mute now, Holly, and we are ready for the Q&A session, which Robin is going to handle.
Yeah.
So I can run the mic.
Okay, that's great. All right. Yeah, that would be great. Please come up, and I'm just sort of going to end
All right,
it.
so we have our first question.
So I don't know if Holly heard this, but we clapped. So maybe we should clap again when she could hear it. So now I wanted to start a question that's like a bit of a, since it's called real altmetrics, is to get real. Is one of the fears we actually have is we fear comparison on these metrics. So the reason you don't know what it means is because we're scared to put my numbers up against somebody else's numbers. What do you think of that?
Do we have more than one mic, possibly?
So I personally, I don't have that fear because and I don't present data without context, but I hear it at our faculty promotion and tenure workshops. I don't want these data to be used to compare me to the medical people on our campus who, like the citation rates, the journal impact factors, everything is inflated.
I don't think so much that we are afraid to do it. Actually, there are a couple of papers, and that's what we've seen for bibliometrics too. They always start on their own community, so like Altmetrics on Altmetrics, and you see comparisons. But I think that the problem right now is that we have so many different influences that push the scores. So of course, if you're at a conference like this, you get a lot of tweets and Twitter followers when I'm presenting something similar at a bibliometrics conference where people are not that Twitter savvy. I don't get that. So I think that the problem is that the comparisons right now are influenced by so many different factors that we don't fully understand yet. And for citations, it took a very long time to come up with a field normalized indicator. For example, as you said, like I wouldn't want to compare myself in terms of citations directly against biomedical science because we know there are more citations. So, but I think what's more of a problem is with Altmetrics that unfortunately we're reducing all this networked information behind the metrics to, again, a number. So even if we've seen that Impact Story and Altmetric, they're doing the same thing, they're using at least the percentile. But since the data is so skewed, it's nice to be in the 99th percentile, but it's not that hard. So, because a few tweets actually get you there, for example. But we could be using the context and the network aspect of who is tweeting and who are the people behind that so much more. Of course, the problem with that is it's not one easy number, and there's no easy this person is higher in the ranking, and that's maybe one of the problems, I think.
I just want to add one thing to that. So what you didn't see in my slides are that the altmetrics that I used and that I've tracked have really helped me to get some of the anecdotal data, particularly the context that Altmetric provides. And I'm not shilling for them. That context, the fact that you can drill down into the source and I can say, oh, these 5 data librarians retweeted me, or this researcher from the School of Public Health liked my retweet and then followed up and asked me about it. That context, those traces are valuable. We just need to get past the numbers, I think.
Holly, did you have anything to add? Why don't we move on to the next question? I'll try to.
Yeah, any other questions? Okay.
It's really two questions. One is, I just came from the biocuration conference, and I wonder how much interaction and overlap you see between data librarians and biocurators. The second question, though, is largely based on Holly's talk. I hope she can hear us. But it seems like we're conflating two different things that we're metricizing. Something, but there's people, like what's your citation, and then there's the data. If somebody has produced, or the software, or whatever the artifact is that's been produced, the information. I mean, we need artifacts, we need metrics for both. And just if you have any comments on that. So it's two things. One is the community cooperation, and the other is distinguishing those types of metrics.
So I'll tackle the data librarian biocurator overlap. That's a community of people that I've been wanting to reach out to. I think in some of the academic medical campuses, there are some overlap there, but you know, there's the language silos and practice silos. I was just speaking with somebody who went to a student who went to a biocuration conference. And so there's overlap, yes. Do we talk to each other enough? Absolutely not. And then the conflation thing, so, you know, one of the things that we talk about when we educate faculty is that there are different levels of metrics. There are item level metrics, which there's a plethora of now. But it used to be that we talked about journal level metrics, so the impact factor, and author level metrics, so the H-index. And sort of helping people parse that apart is something that Stephanie's probably better at than I am. But yes, helping them recognize that the level and the context for these metrics are different, and they need to understand that.
I completely agree that we need to drill down and take all the different kind of outputs. What we are seeing right now for Altmetrics is also that it takes some time for people to change that, right? So even though the idea is to capture any kind of output and the impact of any kind of output, so even saying how much has the data set been used, or how much has the author been mentioned, or even aggregating all those kinds of things. But what we're seeing right now that probably 95% of all captured Altmetrics right now go to the peer-reviewed article. So I think one of these things is it's technical, so it's easier for us to capture something that has a good identifier, and we're better in having good identifiers for papers right now. So so the DOI, the PubMed ID, the archive ID, and so on. So it's easier to track it. We are getting better on other levels. So data sets now also get DOIs and so on. But I think it's also a kind of changing the attitude. And also I think we should remember that the traditional peer-reviewed journal article has a lot of value and merit, right? This is how we do communicate as researchers and present our results. So of course, data sets should be in addition to that, or software and so on and so on. But it also kind of makes sense to start at some point where it's working. So I think that in the next years, this will change.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Christine Borgman, I've been working in this area for a long time. I think the term altmetrics is unfortunate because they are neither alt nor metrics. And if we go back to that and recognize that metrics mean measures, which means you actually have an operationalization and you know what you're measuring, you know, these are at best statistics, they're indicators. Every one of you has said we don't know what they mean. And we've got histories of scholarly communication research that say that what people cite and what they read are very different behaviors. We know that, and here we are conflating them again 40 years after we have that body of research. And I was hoping to have somebody here from, the Leiden Manifesto, from the Dora Declaration, and various others. There's been huge pushback on these, especially in Europe. And I'm hearing sort of drinking the Kool-Aid of these are great, and what do you do with them? I would like to hear from each of you a much more critical stance of if you let go of these being alternative to anything and actually being metrics, that they're simply indicators, because we don't know what they mean, and how can you think about them as indicators, and how can we begin to frame the conversation as scholars about indicators and not allow them to be turned on us and used as measures, which is exactly what's happening.
I completely agree, Chris. I don't know if you were here from the very beginning. Okay. Because I completely agree. The alt doesn't make any sense. Also, the hugest problem of Altmetrics is that the data is so readily available, and the definition of what's an altmetric today is basically what people can capture easily, and that's a huge problem. They're already in use too early, and they are and will be shaping the behavior. That's what we have seen for citations and publications and so on, and that's a huge problem. And I completely agree that we have to boil down and understand any kind of those different and very heterogeneous resources that we're using, where we're capturing counts from. And I think it's actually a pity that we are mostly just capturing counts and not taking the whole the context into considerations. So yeah, I completely agree. It's a really bad term. We should change the term, but we also have to reflect upon what we've already been measuring, because for most of them, yes, we don't know. We're starting to understand Mendeley is more academic use. You're adding a paper to that library that you intend to cite. You probably won't read all of them and so on. I think there's also something that's going to happen with having more full text access. The same thing applies to citations. I mean, believe it or not, there are a lot of authors that cite papers they have never read, right? So I think that having more data and more context will help us to refine these indicators and make them better as indicators. So actually, I agree with you.
I am here. We had some connection problems too, so apologies. I did miss most of the questions.
Did you? Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead and recap.
Okay.
Do you want to? Or do you? Okay.
Yes, Holly, we had a question from the audience. I don't know if you heard that last question or not.
I did not.
Okay. The question really focused on sort of how do we, one, sort of building on what people had talked about in terms of altmetrics aren't alt, and they're not metrics. And how do we sort of stop this trend of them really becoming, in some ways, used as, pardon me, used in, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. It's essentially, how can we answer the question and use them in ways that actually are useful and don't necessarily get us down the road of misusing them in similar ways that citations are misused?
Right. So to answer from my perspective, so I really see them as a guide in helping me figure out what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. And I think that, in a fast-moving field like genomics, there is a lot of buzz, there is a lot of tweeting. Everyone's on their computer all the time. That's probably why. But I think for software development, I have had specific instances like the peaks in tweets where it is a valid, it's not a metric, but I think it's validation that what I'm doing is sort of right. So I don't know if I would cite that in tenure promotion, but I would definitely cite that in a grant proposal, and I would track some of these long-term trends to make the case that this tool maybe does need to be funded for another 1 or 2 year period in terms of my program officer making that case to him.
So I'll just weigh in on this, I think, quickly. So I think as evaluations of research impact or quality, no, they're not. I think what they are traces of dissemination. And again, this is coming from a very pragmatic perspective. So what they allow me to do as a librarian is to trace engagement with a certain community. So I can go back and look at the people who have retweeted or responded or liked or something that I've shared or commented on. And to me, that's a digital sort of demonstration of engagement that I would not have otherwise, because there are no other data librarians in my institution right now. We're a very dispersed community. So for me, it's a communication tool. Not all researchers have those kinds of practices. Those cultures of communication and dissemination vary, and all of this should be rooted in that cultural specificity. But I do think that, yes, people are abusing them, they're misusing them, but it's an opportunity for us to have conversations that are long overdue with faculty, with administrators, at the campus level and department chairs who are really the arbiters of promotion and tenure, at least on my campus. They are the ones who write the letters that say, these are the top tier journals, or these are the high quality places that you want to disseminate your work. And so I think they're an opportunity. No, they're not perfect. No, they are definitely not evaluations or operationalized measures. But until we get program evaluation and metrics to meet in the middle, which would be an interesting conversation, I don't think we're going to be using these digital traces in that way. They are one source of evidence. Shut up.
And just to build on that very, very briefly, so in my world for software metrics, I think something that I would track is people that are reusing the code. So, what happens is that these smaller software packages get wrapped into large behemoths that everyone uses, like Galaxy. And so the people that are using Galaxy aren't going to cite my software specifically, but they might cite, the overall behemoth framework. So the fact that the developers have actually pulled my code in, something like a GitHub fork, or some of these more code repository site are in fact citations for, the software product being reused, versus, a traditional citation of the software paper might just not happen in a case like that.
Wonderful. Thank you, and sorry to cut people off, but we are over time. Thank you, Heather, Holly, and Stephanie, for a really great discussion.